Okay, all right. Good morning, everybody. I'm May, and
And I'm Gerry. And we are here today to ask you all to be our reflective partners in this session, where we're going to examine our teaching practice in the area of global citizenship and DEI. May will first introduce principles of ethical activism and types of activists. And then I will introduce a sample classroom activity designed to raise awareness of global issues and expose students to the concept and practice of social activism. So I hope you'll find these activities to be informed by the principles described by May. But first, we feel it's important to explain our positionality. So first, thanks to May for that beautiful artwork. Hasn't she done a great job there with our portraits? So to amplify my list there just a bit, I'd like to note that I'm actually multiracial, 3/4 white and a quarter Japanese. And I have at some times in my life been so racialized. But I cannot deny, of course, the privilege that the whiteness of my skin usually confers. As you can see there, my nationality, my citizenship, and my permanent residence status here in Japan also clearly show my passport privilege. So next, May, can you please tell us a little more about yourself?
thank you, Jerry. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm May. I'm from Myanmar. I'm currently working as an assistant professor at Nagasaki University. But for this presentation, I'm here as an activist first and an educator second. So I'm a human rights activist from Myanmar. My main form of activism is art. I use art to start protests, start campaigns, to raise funds. I think to date, I've raised about $65,000 from my artwork. As you can see, I am documented, but I'm displaced, which means I have a passport. I am a legal citizen of my country, but I'm unable to return because the government there would arrest me if I return. We don't actually recognize them as government, the dictator, I would say. Okay, having said all of that, despite all of this, I have no regrets. So to quote our one of our favorite authors today, Adrienne Marie Brown from Pleasure Activism, which I believe Gerry and I will be quoting a lot from her. I hope that we will be able to after you listen to our presentation, you will find pleasure in empowering your students to realize that they can make an impact in this world. So let's move on to the next slide.
Okay, so here are 4 keywords that are especially important to us. First, I may be old enough to be May's grandmother, but I ask May not to call me her mentor. Okay, I say let's all call each other accountability partners. And this means that we hold each other to a solemn ethical duty to honestly, truthfully call each other out. For example, whenever May senses my behavior is or could be perceived as biased, like white saviorism, okay, or optical allyship. Next, you may have noticed that on the previous slide that we both identified as both educators and activists in that positionality statement. May, can you talk about this?
Um, yes, sorry. So my story of claiming my identity as an activist is one of reluctance. I wasn't actually very enthusiastic about claiming this title, but as I continue, I didn't want to be an activist most of all because every time I imagine the word activist, I think of somebody who's going out there to protest, and I wasn't doing any of that. I was in Japan. I wasn't doing any kind of protest related to my country, so I didn't think that I deserved to have this title. But activism can be both quiet and loud, and this is what I've learned in the past 2 years. And sometimes, to quote Alice Walker, we are the ones we have been waiting for. So in this presentation, I'll talk a little bit more about activism later. I believe that as educators, we strive for equity and inclusivity in our classrooms, and that's how I define activism, to strive for a transformative justice continuously. In fact, you will see that many prominent activists in history are educators themselves. So if you're an educator who believes this, you might already be an activist.
Okay, so next, we'd like to point out that with the keywords there, theory and practice, we'd like to point out that by deconstructing the subject-object binary of the theorizing subject, objectifying the practice or the practitioner, we aim to demonstrate how our teaching and activism inform each other dynamically in a virtuous circle. With positive outcomes for our students' learning, because we believe it activates their confidence in the power of their agency. And then finally, unconscious bias. This is also an important keyword for us because we're aware that some people may automatically feel an unconscious resistance to the very idea of activism in the classroom. So for starters, this morning as reflective partners, we'd like to ask all of you to take a moment to pause right now and to ask yourself whether you have felt any such resistance to anything we've said up to this point. And if you have, we ask that you not either repress it or allow it to make you unconsciously close your mind to what we have to say about activism. So if a question arises in your mind, we ask you to hold that thought, make a note of it. And to quote Alice Walker again, resistance is the secret to joy. And here also, as an artist, I know that May is especially sensitive to the power of images to trigger defensive reactions rooted in unconscious bias. So let's hear what she has to say about that.
Okay, so when we introduce activism in the classroom, we have to remember that our call for action and representation need to respect the disadvantaged group's dignity, right? We need to recognize their struggles, but we have to be careful about not victimizing them. I'm basically referring to a very tiring example of people using photographs of people of color casually in their slides. If it perpetuates like unfair and inaccurate stereotypes, not to mention that it is not effective in asking to call for action. If we're not making direct efforts to uplift these communities, then using these pictures of them to gain clout in your presentation should be carefully considered. I'm against it. And personally, if I see any kind of presentations like this, I get a very a reaction, which is not very mild to this. So I want to show you an example of what I mean here. So this is a comic that I did when I was raising funds for the civil disobedience movement in my country. So the handwriting is a little bit hard to read, but basically, I give a backstory and the conviction of the person. I highlight that people are struggling, not because they're helpless, they're struggling because they believe in human rights, peace, and democracy. And that's what it means to humanize people when you are trying to promote call for action when you're introducing activism in your classroom. And I think this is something that we should be aware of. Romanticizing poverty, romanticizing struggles is only beautiful in literature. It's not beautiful in real life, because in real life, people get thrown in jail. People get death sentences, right? So please don't romanticize these kind of images. Please be careful. I think that's one of the biggest issues of introducing activism ethically in our classroom. So next, I'd like you all to consider what being an activist means to you as well. We all have our different idea of what activism is. As I've said before, for me, activism is more of an overt form of expression of freedom and thought. But that is not how it is, as I've discovered much later in my journey as an activist. We have here another amazing author and an educator and an activist. And she said that the role of the artist is to make the revolution irresistible. I'd like to add the word activist as well, since I'm an activist and an artist. So how do we make you all see that? Not that you don't see it, but how do we make people see that becoming an activist is actually a pleasurable thing, right? When we have to deal with so many hardships, when we're dealing with people being thrown in jail, being punished for just expressing their opinions in a peaceful manner. Well, pleasure activists believe that by tapping into the potential goodness of in each of us, we can generate justice and liberation, growing a healing abundance where we have been socialized to believe only scarcity exists. So I want to talk a little bit about my journey as an activist. Um, when I became an activist, I think I found there's infinite pleasure and sometimes sadness, of course, and in realizing self-agency and helping others through my activism. And this transcends not only into my personal life, but also into my professional life. So in my own words, I would describe an activist as someone participating in a collective social movement, a person who is making a conscious effort to raise awareness, someone working hard, no matter how insignificant or quiet it may seem, to bring about social change, to question the status quo, to fight towards social justice, and at the same time, enjoying it. So that's what I understand to be pleasure activism in a nutshell. So in the next slide here, um, I wanted to talk a little bit about different types of activists. So we have here citizen. So a citizen is basically, we were referring to regular citizens who promotes positive national values, principles, symbols. For example, they might be promoting democracy, freedom, justice, nonviolent movements, right? And we have a different type of activist as well, and that is the reformer. Reformers are people who are maybe from the in the government, in the law, people who are lawmakers. Okay, and then we have the rebels. Rebels are people who take nonviolent direct action in terms of demonstrations, rallies, and marches, including civil disobedience movements. And the last are the change makers, and those are the people who organize, educate, get involved in pre-existing mass-based grassroots organizations, networks, coalitions, and activists on the issues, right? So these are all different types of activists. Maybe we're one of them, maybe we're also two of these at the same time. But we need all different types of activists in our community, in our society, to bring about lasting social change. And I think that we as individuals, as educators and activists, can decide what type of role we want to play. So next, I will talk very briefly about different types of activism. So we have quiet activism, we have loud activism. I've mentioned this a couple of times in this presentation. Quiet is individual and loud is basically joining in protests in the streets and also on the internet these days, of course. So quiet activism can include just you making an active you taking an active approach and how you can live your life better, just so that you are not you're a good member of society, right? Maybe if you are aware of, for example, the DEI issues, and if you're raising them in your classes as to include inclusivity in your classes, you're being an activist in your way. If you, for example, in my for myself, since the coup, I've stopped buying clothes from fast fashion brands because I've had the opportunity to talk to so many garment workers in my country, and I realized how many brands in this world are actually contributing to violating human rights to produce fast fashion. So I've made an active choice not to buy anything from fast fashion brands, right? So this is something that we can perhaps incorporate in our daily life, and that is quiet activism. Loud activism, of course, is when you're starting campaigns, when you're starting petitions, and when you're trying to rally people into cooperating and in your movements. We can also have different types of activism inside the classroom, outside the classroom as well. And Gerry's going to be talking about some of these ways that she's incorporated activism in her classes. So the next one is, I wanted to talk about two things that I've learned from being an activist and how I started introducing activism in my classroom. The first is starting from within. This is based on my personal experience. I'd like to start with a quote from Paulo Freire. Conscientization is the process of becoming aware of one's social and political, sorry, I was reading Gretchen's message, context, and taking action to change it. From my experience, being a Myanmar, I couldn't remain a bystander to the loss of human rights and democracy in my country. So I started being an activist. But in the process, I also learned so many things. I learned about my privilege. I learned also about other countries and other activists as well, to have a better understanding of who I am as a human being, my values on like global issues, on DEI issues. All of these knowledge, all of this realization became a part of my identity, and it in turn changed me into a different type of teacher and also as a researcher and an educator. So this is something that I have learned. And the next is to a very easy thing to do is to invite activists to our classes. So please reach out to activists. They're very happy to talk about their activism. We all don't have to be experts on on every topic that we want to introduce in to our students. So I'm again like quoting Paulo Freire here. He said that there's a dialogic approach to education where teachers and students engage in a mutual process of learning and discovery. And this is something that you can do together with your students by inviting activists to your classroom. Okay, so I'm going to stop talking now, and next is Gerry's part.
Okay, thank you, May, and everyone. I'm sure you all felt May's passion and her wisdom, okay, shining through there. But just to make sure that those sort of ideal principles and categories and types don't remain too abstract or idealistic, I'd now like to share just one more example of one concrete way you could integrate these principles into your own course design. It involves the use of a website called Global Citizen. So first, here are just some basics about their mission, okay, and their impact. Next. Okay, so the website is divided into these three areas: poverty, planet, and equity. And within each area, students can use search terms and filters to narrow down their choice of topics, like by country or by specific topic. Okay, next. Okay, then a selection of actions is provided for each topic. For example, there may be a short, engaging quiz with just 5 or 6 questions, but it's very effective in piquing intellectual curiosity. It also helps a student develop a more informed opinion. And then there are various message templates, which are often formatted like close questions. So the one shown there starts, I stand with refugees because ... and the student fills in the blank. And then another message template has a prompt that invites you to tell your personal story. And the one shown here, I know you can't read it, but just to give you a sort of a placeholder there, invites young carers to tell their stories about how caring for family members impacts their schooling. And this is something we hear about in Japan as well as all over the world. Okay, and then there are also other different activities like petitions, uploading videos, tweets, and so on. Okay, next. Okay, now I am not an artist like May, but because I strongly identify as an art lover, okay, and as a bridge builder, I'd also like to point out that this website includes podcasts and musical projects such as annual concerts and albums starring the likes of Ed Sheeran, Elton John, Coldplay, Billie Eilish, Lizzo, okay, all sorts of wonderful artists. And the photo at upper left is last year's huge Global Citizen concert in New York City's Central Park. And similar concerts were held simultaneously around the world. So my question here is it biased to use such a website in the classroom? Is it any more biased than the free, but not really free, news we too often download from the internet, unconsciously assuming that it's objective just because it passes, although just barely, as news? And can you imagine the pleasure of offering your students something better. Next. So to bring us full circle, we'd like to conclude with this quote. Ultimately, pleasure activism is us learning to make justice and liberation the most pleasurable experiences we can have on this planet. I think May has something to add here.
I just want to add by the same author that pleasure is a measure of freedom. And I hope all of us can find infinite pleasure and while promoting other people's freedom in the process. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.